everybody for coming. We're very lucky to have Mohammed Alsudairi here. He is a scholar who works on several different things, but among them, probably most notably, are politics and international relations, especially between the Arab world and China. But he's also, and I'm not sure how comfortable he will be to admit it, a pretty authoritative historian of Islamic movements in China. So we're really lucky to have him. He's a lecturer in politics and international relations of the Arabic-speaking world at the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies, and that is at Australian National University. So thank you for coming, and welcome, Mohammed.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, I just wanted to thank the Manchester China Institute for this wonderful invitation, especially coming from the colleagues Ryan, David, and Pete. I really appreciate it, as well as the team for organizing this, whether the beautiful design of the poster or organizing the logistics, which can be a bit complicated from time to time. The other thing I also wanted to begin by is to just express my solidarity with the people of Palestine at a very difficult moment defined by genocide and ethnic cleansing, and also to express my solidarity with the people of Syria for what is really appearing to be an emancipatory moment that I hope will yield a Syria, but also a wider Levant defined by dignity, peace, and also just, overall well-being for all the human beings there, regardless of background, sect, faith, or belief. So my talk today is on China and the question of Palestine. And what I'll be specifically looking at or exploring is kind of the history of China's engagement with Palestine and Palestinian movements over the course of kind of 70 years. And what really prompted this talk was kind of a response to an emerging narrative that I've noticed. And I'm always kind of very much interested in this space of the narratives that are woven around China and its role in the Middle East. But a particular narrative is the emergence of the People's Republic as a credible mediator in the context of the Palestine-Israel conflict, which is sometimes rendered into China coming in as a savior or a backer of the Palestinians in confrontation with the US, which is a conventional, traditional backer of Israel. And of course, what has really kind of drummed up this narrative once more are really the events over the past year, starting with the war in Gaza, where, for instance, after the 7th of October attacks by roughly a month, Saudi Arabia organized an exceptional summit in Riyadh where it gathered the heads of states and foreign ministers of Muslim and Arab countries with the idea of kind of drumming up global support for reviving the two-state solution, but also primarily achieving a ceasefire in Gaza. And they organized a delegation of the foreign ministers of several Arab and Muslim states. The first country that they went to was China. And that kind of, underscored Beijing's perception as a primary great power that can really wade into this conflict. Another major event that happened a bit earlier this year, particularly in July 2024, was a meeting that was hosted by Beijing, bringing in the different Palestinian factions together. And the idea being here is that China was trying to reconcile their differences of view to bring about a unity government that would then kind of jumpstart the peace process once more. And there's a lot of literature that had been written around these two events and what they mean, but primarily they really come down to the notion of China emerging as a credible mediator and potentially even a savior in this context. And I think this narrative in many ways draws on two particular sources or founts. And we're going to unpack them in a moment. But the first one is essentially that China is perceived, particularly from the late 1990s, as emerging as a great power of significant influence within the Middle East, right? So wherever you look at, its footprint is quite visible. Economically, China is the primary customer of most of the hydrocarbon exporting countries. Some of them actually, their dependency on the Chinese market as an export destination is significant. A country like Oman actually, give or take on the data from the last 2 years, 75 to 85% of all of its hydrocarbon exports go to the Chinese market alone. China is the #1 trading partner for almost all of the Gulf states, as well as the other Arab states, Iran and Israel. So in many ways, its footprint is quite significant. Politically, it designates its relationships with many of these states as strategic partners, 战略伙伴, right, in the kind of the lingo of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. The Belt and Road Initiative covers all of the states there with the exception of Israel. So wherever you look, there is a very strong and pronounced Chinese presence, right? Even China's first overseas military base emerges in the periphery of the Middle East in Djibouti, right? And that also kind of led to a lot of speculation about what this means. Now, this expanding footprint in its own right is tied oftentimes with the narrative of great power competition. So if you look at a lot of the academic literature, the media coverage, and even kind of the debates at official policymaking levels, especially in Washington, D.C., right? A whole discussion on China in the Middle East is intertwined with the idea of competition with the US, right? Just very recently, in fact, the Congressional Senate issued a report of over 80 pages dealing with China in the Middle East, right? I mean, they do this actually periodically, but it just tells you a lot about how this presence is really interpreted through a particular prism. And it's something that has gone stronger over the years. I mean, it's very interesting how the Trump administration, the first one, began a project where they would appoint officers at different embassies who were primarily dedicated to watching Chinese activities in many different parts of the world. The Middle East was actually a launching point for that program. So they appointed one in Abu Dhabi, one in Cairo, one in other places. This project has expanded significantly under the Biden administration, and it's not likely to go away anytime soon. So the point of this, and why I'm kind of highlighting that it's tied to this great power competition narrative, is that in many ways this renders or leads to an interpretation of China as mediator as being read against the US, right? That China's wading into becoming a mediator and kind of supporting diplomatic efforts is read ultimately as something where it's attempting to usurp the US, right? And this is kind of something that ties a lot of different elements across what I would call campus cartographies together. So people who are very keen on protecting US interests read it as a challenge. People who are anti-US read this as a confirmation that the world is heading in a multipolar direction. So you can see how this is kind of a prism that orients and leads to a particular reading of China's engagement with Palestine through that. The other fount is a revolutionary legacy, right? And I'll get into that a lot more in detail in a moment. But essentially, China is in many ways a unique power when you think of it in comparison to many of the other great powers, such as the United States, Russia, as well as India, in relation to Palestine. So for instance, the Soviet Union was the first state to recognize Israel. The US was second. India did not have full diplomatic relations with Israel until 1992, but had informal ties and actually consular level relations from the 1950 onwards. China is the only state among these great powers that did not recognize Israel until 1992, right? In fact, and it's very interesting when you think of it in conjunction to the fact that Israel was the first state in the Middle East to recognize the People's Republic, but it was never actually reciprocated in turn, right? So this is kind of very interesting. And you can see also that in terms of the residues of symbolic solidarity with Palestine, how states perform and continue to maintain kind of, or draw on the legacies of support in their political language. This is very much absent from the United States. Russia does it somewhat. In India, that language has been largely jettisoned out due to Hindutva, right? And the rise of kind of a new type of politics under the BJP. China actually still retains much of that language. If you look at its interface and interactions with Palestinians, I'll give you an example in just a second. It still draws on that legacy of revolutionary support in describing its engagement with Palestinians. This is, by the way, an image of the Palestinian embassy in Beijing, in actually not that far from 𝗱𝗲𝘁. So if you guys go drinking, you can walk around, you'll see it. It's not that far off. it's actually used to be also the headquarters of the PLO mission. And China was one of the first states to actually give the the Palestine Liberation Organization an office abroad. And this is its site. And what I mean, of course, kind of by also the legacies of revolution is not just kind of the role of China, but the way in which China has been internalized in the imaginaries of Palestinian revolution making. So if you look at, for example, a lot of the major figures that are sometimes romanticized at the current moment, people like 𝗘𝗃𝗃𝗁 for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, he is often very much associated with the embrace of Maoism in Arab political thought, right? I mean, he was a very big advocate for People's War, an advocate for the need to kind of pursue warfare from the countryside and encircle the city. Many of these elements really appear in his thought. And you can see, I mean, he has an image of Mao right in the back. Mao's Little Red Book was very popular among this organization, among others, including some of those that seceded eventually and became the radical Maoists, such as the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. 𝗱𝗲𝗁𝗂𝗃, in fact, used to be called 𝗱𝗃𝗁𝗂𝗃, right, in the Arabic tradition because of his kind of very strong support for the Maoist political tradition. And actually, this is the example I wanted to highlight with regards to how the Chinese state mines these revolutionary traditions. So this is an invitation that had been extended by the International Department of the Communist Party of China for the centennial founding of the CPC, right? And 𝗱𝗃𝗁𝗂𝗃 was specifically chosen because of kind of him being a particularly prominent figure in the Palestinian political landscape of someone who embraced kind of the old Maoist tradition, kind of an old comrade and friend of the Chinese state. So the crux of my argument is as follows, is that when we consider these two sources, right, the kind of the great power competition prism on the one hand, as well as the revolutionary legacy on the other, they feed into an imagining of China as kind of a mediator, savior, and potential balancing power against the US, right, in the context of Palestine, Israel. You could actually even apply this with relation to many other issues and flashpoints in the region, and I can talk about it in the Q&A if people are interested, Iran, Syria, and so forth. But what I would argue is that, in fact, when you really look at Chinese foreign policy, Chinese thinking about these issues, and the pattern of Chinese behavior, is that China is really ultimately a very conservative power. It's very much disinterested in playing a substantive mediating role. And the only instances of successful Chinese mediation that we can think of today are only successful because the local actors enable and accept that mediation. And there are actually very substantive case studies that show that, especially, for example, with regards to the very well-known and publicized Saudi-Iranian détente that was signed in 2023, right? That a lot of people talk about as an example of Chinese successful mediation, but there's a lot of problems with that claim. So as a result of these twin sources and kind of also the limits of what China is willing to do and what it has done, this creates kind of these cycles of expectation and aspiration that are ultimately thwarted by the realities. So we go into these cycles of hope and disillusionment that actually do sometimes find expression, for example, in Arabic media and Arabic discourses about China. Unfortunately, I don't see that as changing anytime soon, given how the Chinese state is configured, how it conducts its foreign policy, and so forth. So maybe now we can begin to unpack a bit these twin sources. I'll begin maybe with the first one because that's the shorter bit, and then we'll jump to the second one because it really creates an opening to think about the history of China's engagement with the Palestinians. So I kind of position myself, along with a few other colleagues who work on China-Middle East relations in the contemporary kind of era, as part of a revisionist camp. Because ultimately, if you look at much of the scholarship that's produced, it tends to very much subscribe to the great power narrative that I had mentioned earlier. And I think my primary critique to that is that on the one hand, it tends to ignore what Chinese official and semi-official sources say about China's relationship with the Middle East, which oftentimes just really openly declares the region as a third or fourth tier area of strategic importance for China. To draw from a very good friend of mine, Andrea Giselli, brilliant scholar on Chinese security and overseas deployments, the Middle East is the most important region among the unimportant regions to China. That's one way of putting it, right? And you can see that really come out in a lot of the textual sources. And if people are interested as to why, despite this big economic presence, I'd be more than happy to kind of unpack it a bit. The other part, or the other problem as to why this great power prism is distortive, is that it tends to ignore how local dynamics drive and co-opt the Chinese presence for their own goals, right? I mean, there's a lot of examples for that, but the Belt and Road Initiative is a really, really good example. So oftentimes, when you look at the way the Belt and Road Initiative is depicted and discussed in the media, you see these slick maps with Beijing at the center and all these dots around the Eurasian continent that are tied together by maritime and overland routes. In the Arabian Peninsula, if you scrutinize it, there are three major dots. One, I wish I put a map actually. One is in Kuwait, which is to the northwest, Silk City. One is in Oman, 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁, which is a port city to the southeast of the Arabian Peninsula. And then another port called, or another center called the Jizan Economic City, which is to the southwest of Arabia. Right? And these are depicted as essentially chess pieces in China's geopolitical binding of the Arabian Peninsula into its ambitious economic plans. However, if you do proper local case study work and field work, which is always lacking in this type of geopolitical analysis, you'll immediately come to recognize that almost all of these are projects that predate the Belt and Road Initiative. Some of them actually go back 30 years ago, where different governments are doing industrial projects, ports, and while the Belt and Road Initiative came up, they repackaged it in order, from the perception of officials, to court Chinese investments, right? So is this really China's geopolitical imposition on the Middle East, or is it local actors pursuing their own goals, right? So I think when you begin to take these two elements seriously in the geopolitical analysis, what the Chinese are saying, what the local actors are doing and saying, you actually begin to approximate the realities of understanding China's presence in the region, right? A very, very good example is actually Syria, very relevant right now. I wrote an article with Andrea Giselli looking specifically at Sino-Syrian relations. And if you look at the media discussions about it before Assad's fall for the last 14 years, there was this constant trope that was recurring and emerging, which was China was going to come in and reconstruct Syria. It was in very close alignment with Russia and wanted to kind of capture the Syrian market and achieve certain political and military ends there. But actually, when you looked at the Chinese discourse, when you looked at the local discourse, and you actually looked at the data, China's Syria relationship is perhaps the most humble and modest among all those in the region. And there has been no Chinese money that has materialized in Syria for very rational reasons. But that shows how big the gap is between kind of the perceptions and imaginaries and the actual realities that are far more modest on the ground. Now, since we've already unpacked a bit kind of that one source, let's go into the second source, which is the revolutionary legacy that I would argue is pretty conservative. So I would say that notwithstanding a brief period of domestic foreign policy radicalization, which is around 1965 to 1971, kind of really the height of the 𝗱𝗲𝗀𝗀, the Cultural Revolution, which properly began in 66, but we can add 65 into it. The past 70 years have really been one in which China has espoused a very soft support for the two-state solution, and in fact has not called for any new or put forward any particularly new visions about how to solve the Palestine-Israel conflict, right? It's really much in a global consensus, as we'll see later. And I would also argue that interests, as opposed to ideological solidarity, have guided and shaped Chinese support to Palestine and Palestinian movements, even during that radical phase. And we'll see the logic of it in a moment. But I wanted to just highlight, for those interested in doing their own reading on China and Palestine during this particular period, like the Maoist era, I highly recommend 𝗱𝗲𝗁𝗂𝗃𝗲𝗁's work. I'm very much interested in Arab sinology and kind of the traditions of Arab intellectuals thinking about China. He's a very interesting Kuwaiti scholar who ended up going to China in the 70s, wrote his PhD in the London School of Economics. And this particular book looks at 3 case studies, one of which is Palestine, but the other one is also Oman. Oman is a really interesting country that had its Marxist revolution in the late 60s that also had backing from China. So he kind of explores a lot of that. If you want to do your own reading, highly recommend it. So now let's kind of go into looking into this conservative legacy or revolutionary legacy. So I mentioned how China's position has really been one of soft support for the two-state solution. And you can see this really from 1949 onwards. So this is a quote, for example, from the People's Daily, where essentially the Chinese state calls for consultations, the necessity of avoiding military conflict, and the need to kind of achieve an equitable peace within the UN framework, right? So this is, again, part of that language from very early on that emerges in the public discourse of the state. Now, what is unique in the 1950s is kind of this soft embrace of Palestine that was largely a result of China's engagement with the Arab Muslim bloc, right? So in the 1950s, the main dilemma that the People's Republic was facing was its struggle for recognition against the Republic of China, right? The Kuomintang had fled to Taiwan as a result of the Civil War, but many states still continued to recognize the nationalists in the island as the representatives of the legitimate government for China. So what happened in, for example, the context of a very major meeting, the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung, which brought together many of the independent states across Asia and Africa, the Arab state bloc was really the largest among the independent states in the non-Western world. And so for the Chinese state, it became kind of a very logical political move to in fact embrace Palestine and acknowledge it in that context of struggling for recognition. Here's an image of Zhou Enlai with 𝗱𝗲𝗁 al-Husseini, who is one of the kind of iconic figures of the Palestinian national movement. And again, you know, this is to kind of also push back against this ideological romanticization. What was happening in the 1950s with respect to the Palestinians was something that the People's Republic was doing with a whole range of actors, including those that would be depicted as reactionaries and feudal elements, right? So there was a lot of engagement, for example, with the monarchical states of the Arabian Peninsula. This is an image of the Crown Prince of Yemen, Badr al-Din, with Mao, right? And there was an exchange of recognition in 1958. Throughout the 1950s, I did this work with a colleague where we looked at the archives in Academia Sinica, in the mainland, as well as in Saudi. And it was very obvious that the People's Republic was really eager and desperate to normalize and open diplomatic ties with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, notwithstanding claims that it was, you know, the fountainhead of Arab conservatism and ideological backwardness. So there's a pragmatism that really runs through China's diplomacy during this era. But it's important to note that because of these types of engagements, right, and these types of political openings, it allowed Palestinians, especially Palestinian leaders, to develop ties with the People's Republic, right? So throughout the late 1950s, for example, a lot of key members of what would later become the Palestine Liberation Organization, which would be founded in 1964, would make their way to China under government tours, right? So for example, Yahya Hamouda is one figure. These are images of him, I think from 1957, and you know, those kind of month-long tours going around to many different parts of China, Hangzhou, going to the Dongbei to visit the industrial sites and whatnot. And this kind of opening ultimately allows for China to establish formal ties with the Palestine Liberation Organization, right? Because prior to this, most of the way in which the Palestine issue was mediated between China and the Arab world was primarily through Arab governments like Egypt, right? So this kind of opening facilitates a development where China begins to interact and interface with those who would claim authority directly. So this is an image of Mohammad Alsudairi, who was the first general secretary of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and they kind of established ties. And this kind of comes at an inflection point in the relationship, because this is the moment where China begins to enter radicalization phase, both domestically and in terms of its foreign policy. So as they build these ties become critical for kind of using the Palestinian issue for China's own foreign policy purposes. So you can see the shift in language, for example, formally, where, for instance, imperialism is afraid of China and the Arabs. Israel and Formosa are bases of imperialism in Asia. You are the gate of the great continent and we are the rear. They created Israel for you and Formosa for us. Their goal is the same, Formosa being Taiwan. And it's interesting, actually, when you think about also the depictions of Israel in kind of the language of the party state, because in the 1950s, Israel was also seen as an actor that was being used by imperialists, right, to ignite conflict with the Arabs. But here, the whole depiction of Israel transforms, and it becomes kind of part and parcel of the imperial plot, and that needs to be eliminated, right? So this is kind of part of this language. And you can see kind of the growth in this radical phase of a lot of symbolic support that becomes part of this revolutionary memory of Chinese solidarity with the Palestinians. So one thing that happens, for example, in 1965 is that the Chinese state begins this tradition where on the 15th of May, they would have mass rallies for Palestine. And this is a tradition that would be maintained up to 1971, after which it would be downscaled. It's still a tradition that's maintained today. So typically, it's an event that's held at the State of Palestine Embassy. Xi Jinping, every year on the 15th of May, would send a telegram congratulating the comrades, etc. So it tells you a bit about kind of the continued resonance of these old revolutionary ties. And certainly, the language also of this radical period is one of kind of confidence of its eternal continuation, right? Which is really kind of goes against the very logic of politics. But I like this quote from Liang Zhengzhi, who is the head of the Xinhua, who said, "We shall not recognize Israel for a minute, for a day, or even for the next 100 years." Unfortunately, the reality of politics is that such statements don't really age well. And actually, I thought of it in comparison to another statement that was said only a few years after this by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. So King Faisal, he ruled from the mid-60s until he was assassinated in 1975. He visited Taiwan in 1971. He was a very close ally of Taiwan. Most people don't know this, but the relations between these two states were very intimate. They have a very interesting military dimension, if anyone wants to raise it in the Q&A. But when King Faisal went to Taiwan, he made a statement along the lines of, "We will never, ever recognize the communists for the next few centuries." And it's true, Saudi Arabia was the last Arab state to recognize the People's Republic, but we didn't even really hit 20 years. But it just tells you kind of the way in which sometimes these statements have an ideological emptiness. Now, the reason why we see kind of this embrace of the Palestinians in the context of kind of this radicalization is primarily the intensification of the Sino-Soviet struggle, right? So since the late 50s, there's been a building up confrontation between the two powers that really reaches its apogee throughout the 1960s. And both were trying to claim ideological leadership of the global south or the third world, whatever term you wanted to use. And Palestine, along with Vietnam and other flashpoints, were really a key arena which these two powers tried to appropriate and claim ownership of. For those who are interested in this history, I highly recommend Jeremy Friedman's book, Shadow Cold War, which specifically looks at the Soviet-Chinese struggle across many different cultural, political spheres in the Arab world, in Southeast Asia and beyond. Now, this, of course, embrace of the Palestinians did yield to tangible forms of material support. It's not all just simply rhetorical ones or performative ones. For instance, the relationship with the PLO and also other Palestinian factions underneath it, because the PLO is an umbrella group that embraces multiple parties, including Fatah, is that it led to a lot of military support and training. So one of the arrangements that were done was to have Palestinians come, primarily from the camps in Syria or Lebanon or Jordan, to come in like 20 and 30 numbers to China, as well as maybe Vietnam, Laos, and the DPRK, to do military training for 6-8 months. right? They went to, I believe, the Nanjing Military Academy. There was a few other places that they went to. But this became kind of a pattern where a lot of Palestinians obtained military training there. This is Yasser Arafat, who was the very famous general secretary of the PLO, with kind of the batch of individuals who had gone for that training in China in 1969. And I should say that this kind of relationship, kind of this military relationship, created openings for a lot of Palestinians to eventually strike roots within China. So one particularly wonderful individual, Mustapha al-Safarini, I've had a lot of opportunities to sit down with him in Beijing, very odd fellow, but very charming. He came to China around 1968, 1969 for military training. And he was intending to go back to fight in the front. But what happened is that he was asked by the PLO to remain in China and to kind of learn Chinese and stay and represent the diplomatic interests of the PLO. So he kind of narrates a lot of his experiences. I put like images of the book, one in Chinese, one in Arabic, 𝗱𝗲𝗁 في الصين, My Days in China. And it's really a fascinating look into kind of the very early diasporic life of Palestinians there. Because he says, like, he was asked to learn Chinese, but this was the Cultural Revolution. China's institutions and universities were closed down. So they essentially brought him to Beida, Peking University. They opened up a big lecture room for him. They brought out a cadre who was a former lecturer from re-education, and they asked him to teach him Chinese. So he recollects, being the only student in an empty class, and they were trying to develop the pedagogy of it. And he relates this funny story where his first lesson was the word "wo," I, and the guy kept pointing at his nose. So for the longest time, for the next few weeks, he thought "wo" meant nose, essentially. So he had a very weird experience of it. But eventually, he kind of remains in China, and he becomes the PLO diplomat to North Korea, Laos. His wife is Laotian. He was introduced to her through Zhou Enlai. And eventually, he becomes the State of Palestine's diplomat in the 1990s. So these kind of openings did have kind of diasporic resonances and footprints, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, but this kind of radical phase comes to an end around 1971. I mean, you can call it 𝗘𝗃𝗀𝗀. I don't know, they'd like to be called that way. But essentially what enables that, or a reversion back to the norm that existed in the 1950s, is essentially normalization with the United States, right? And a desire to work with the United States against the Soviet threat, and also working with US allies across the Middle East. So almost immediately, military aid is stopped to many of the Palestinian factions. The language begins to revert towards calling the Palestinians to work on developing a united front among themselves, as opposed to eliminating more radical factions. There emerges a language of opposing terrorism and armed struggle, which again was kind of an interruption from the past. And there was also growing support for Arab-Israeli peacemaking sidestepping the Palestinians. So people don't know this, but the People's Republic, for example, was very supportive of the Camp David Accords, right, which was between Egypt and Israel and signed in 1978-79. So this led ultimately to a freeze in Sino-Palestinian relations for much of the 70s. So you can see here, for instance, in terms of Arafat's 14 visits to China, between 1971 to 1981, there are no recorded visits, right? So there are repercussions to kind of this jettisoning out of radical support for the Palestinians. Nevertheless, and this is really the work that I'm far more interested in, there was still a very lively diasporic and intellectual life of Palestinians in China itself, right? So for instance, there was still a large number of Palestinians who were coming in for study under scholarships provided by the People's Republic. Some of them left many major contributions on Arab life in China. One of them is, for example, 𝗱𝗲𝗁 wonderful, I've got to meet him before he passed away. He had a very unfortunate heart attack. But he was one of the people who came in the late 70s, early 80s, studied in Northeast China in Shenyang, I believe. And he related this story once to me about how when the US, after the formal normalization of relations, which happened in 1978, the US opened an embassy, but also opened consulates in many different parts of China. He remembers the day in which the American Consular of Affairs came to Shenyang, and he went with a group of other Palestinians and sympathizing Chinese, and they went up to the roof of the building that the Consular of Affairs was arriving in. And as soon as his car arrived, they dumped a lot of paint on his car, right? They were not punished, but it was kind of like part of this, continued mode of resistance that the Palestinians expressed, and I'll talk a bit about more of that in a moment. But 𝗱𝗲𝗁𝗃 is primarily remembered as the head of the Al Jazeera bureau in China, who spoke excellent Chinese, waded very deeply into Chinese social media on Weibo, and kind of was very active in promoting the Palestinian cause. There was also many in the 70s and 80s who came as foreign experts, people who worked for the Chinese kind of propaganda system that was directed outwards, translating a lot of Chinese texts into Arabic, typically English translations of them. But one of the famous ones from Palestine was Mohammed 𝗱𝗲𝗁𝗃𝗲𝗁, who translated a lot of works of Baijin and Dusha, for example, among others. And I should say that what's really fascinating, and this is something that I've done a lot of interviews with the people who are part of that generation, is that the Palestinians who came, whether for military training or came for university study or what have you, a lot of them had a very lively protest life within China. These were people who were constantly mobilizing and organizing demonstrations in Beijing and Nanjing and Shanghai to go to the consular missions, the Western ones that were there in any case, and were very active in expressing their voices. This is an image that I obtained from a good friend of mine in Beijing, very, very rare one, of what is probably the last Arab demonstration in Beijing and probably in all of China, from around April of May of 1988, following the assassination of Khalil al-Wazir, who was a very well-known PLO official who was assassinated by Israel in Tunisia. So this is kind of part of that legacy of the 1980s. Now, when we enter into the 1990s, and from here, really, a lot of these claims are true well into the 2000s and 2010s, is that what we see is that China enters into what I call the global consensus on Palestine, right? In a sense, it really kind of begins to fit its traditional positions, notwithstanding the aberration of the radical phase, into a global language of how to address and deal with the Palestinian issue. So for example, it does dual recognition of the state of Palestine in 1988 and Israel in 1992. It begins to express very strong support for UN resolutions concerning a two-state solution. It begins to express support for the Oslo Agreement. It supports many regional and international interventions aimed at reaching a two-state solution, the Quartet, the Arab Peace Initiative, though it itself doesn't really wade into that or play a big role. It also welcomed the Abrahamic Accords, right, which were the deals struck between the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Israel, right, to kind of sidestep the Palestinian issue, but have direct peace between them. So it really tells you a lot about kind of the logic of the Chinese state and its reading about kind of how to achieve peace, which is really unremarkable when you think of it from the kind of the global norm. Now, this is not to say that China did not have its own kind of initiatives. For instance, it had appointed several special envoys to the Middle East, a practice that continues today, although they don't really do much. They visit, they share opinions, they drink tea with different officials, and they go back. They've held peace symposiums. They've also had what are called sometimes the 4-point advocacies. Sometimes they're Wudian, really, also 5 points, I guess, where they kind of offer China's perspective on how to achieve peace. But these are very broad. I encourage you to go look at some of them, but they're along the lines of, everyone knows we need the two-state solution. We call for adherence to these laws in the UN, et cetera. We also call for encouraging international development between the two sides, and we call also for regional cooperation to bring about peace. So it's a very diffused, very watered-down language that doesn't really yield or tell us much about a state that has its own unique vision that promises to break the gridlock. Now, this all, by the way, the assimilation into the global consensus has occurred as Sino-Israeli relations have boomed, right? So Israel, most people don't know this, has been a very important conduit for military technologies into China. Right? This was the case in the 80s, for instance, when a lot of armaments taken from the Soviet armies of Syria and Egypt were given to China. And after Tiananmen, for instance, when sanctions regimes were imposed by Japan and many Western countries, Israel was a major conduit for a lot of technologies that the Chinese state needed. Economically, there's a lot of entanglements in the last 2 years that have also been tied to the notion of Israel as a startup nation at the technological forefront. And there's been a lot of other elements into that, that when you consider the numbers or compare China's relationship with Israel on the one hand and with Palestine on the other, the contrast could not be more severe, right? In terms of, for instance, I mean, let's not even talk about trade volume because it's really irrelevant as an indicator for economic ties, although Israel is way up, 13 billion, with the state of Palestine, West Bank, and Gaza, it's non-existent. But in terms of investment flows, it's really significant. And nothing in the case of the Palestinians. Even in terms of Chinese labor influxes, which have sometimes served, for example, the West Bank settlements, China has been a major supplier of that, right? The Chinese state has tried to kind of push for bans against the involvement of Chinese workers in the settlements primarily, but it hasn't really yielded to any tangible changes in how intimate and entangled these two places have become. So I guess to conclude, the question of Palestine, unfortunately, has a very stale answer, right? At least from China, in the sense that if you look at what China's vision for peace, it's a very reserved one that operates within a global consensus where everyone knows what needs to be done, but doesn't really offer visions or pathways forward that are unique or distinct. It also has a very limited desire to intervene. It already obtains much of its interests across the region. It has good ties with many of the different actors there. And such a role of a mediator or a savior imposes political costs that no rational great power would like to wade into. In addition, it's already costly for the US to play that role. I mean, if you look at regional surveys of the US, it's a detested power for good reason, right? China doesn't really need that. And it already, again, obtains much of what it does. Additionally, China's mediational diplomacy is largely contingent on local parties already open to resolution. So again, when I mentioned earlier the Saudi-Iranian détente, which is much celebrated around the world, right, as an example of Chinese successful diplomacy, if you look at the details, that détente was primarily enabled by the fact that both Tehran and Riyadh were exhausted by their conflict for over a decade, and in fact had multiple rounds of talks in Oman, in Iraq prior, but both of them opted to bring in China because they wanted to send messages to the United States. So whether it's really an example of Chinese mediation is open to question. And I suspect that in the case of Israel-Palestine, there is really no incentive, for example, for Israel to get rid of its US benefactor, which shields it, protects it, and forwards its interests, to replace it for another great power mediator. There's just simply no logic to it. So the local facilitating factors do not obtain. Having said that, Palestine is still symbolically important for China, right? It's still invoked in many different fora. And if you recall, when the Xinjiang was particularly at its apogee, right? The crisis from 2017 onwards, and there was a global debate about genocide and the practices there. If you look now at the Chinese state's position since Gaza, but even before slightly, they essentially strike back against human rights claims of the West regarding Xinjiang using Palestine. I mean, it all kind of really, all of these actors are hypocritical, but it just shows kind of the continued relevance of Palestine symbolically. And I think these kind of elements, when you take them in together, the limits of what China can do, the symbolic invocation of Palestine, it leads these cycles of expectation that China can play a mediation or savior role, which just simply does not exist. I'll stop here, and I will finish with this image. I'll leave you with this image of Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, who used a very flowery insult about China. I kind of, bleep, the sister of China in a shoe, to translate it more directly. I think it really captures kind of the real limitations of China-Palestine relations and China's engagement with that question. Thank you so much for listening.